being very careful, being very scared, we end up just kind of sanding down all the rough edges instead of building something new and building something out. And that means that we feel daunted when we discuss representation because we talk a lot about representation as the mitigation of pain, but we don't talk about representation as a creator of joy.
They aren't, I don't think in most, maybe they don't realize this, but in practice, again, in terms of the function of the thing, they're not hiring you to make their story better. Otherwise, they would hire writers. They're hiring you to make the press and the Twitter harpies leave them alone, to make sure they don't offend anyone. Now, it's a losing battle because we're offended. It's not a function of offense. It's a function of compliance with the ideology. If you don't comply, and you do it very politely, if you show even the slightest hint of dissent against the ideology, no matter how polite you are, you'll be attacked, if noticed, just as hard as someone who is well against it, or roughly as hard. They want to show complete deference to the ideology because they just don't want that trouble. They're making a game. They don't want to talk about ideology. Now, in practice, I don't want to say that they have to, because I want them to not have to. In today's society, though, they will be pursued for failing to make it about ideology, which is what you do. They hired you, I think, with the assumption that you could just smooth over the rough edges, make sure that their game isn't going to offend anyone unnecessarily, and then they move on and publish it. That's what you are. You pass butter. That's what you are. That's your purpose. You're not a writer. You are the mafia's men come by to make sure that you're not harboring any, I don't know, police officers in the house. You're not making it easier. You don't have any like undercover officers helping you. The analogy doesn't quite fit for that, but they're making sure that you comply with the mob. Making sure that you're not running a competing moonshine business or whatever. Making sure you're not running a competing business. Making sure that you don't have any weapons in your house that you could confront them with. That's what you're hired for. Not as a writer. If you were hired as a writer, you would be a writer, but you're not. If anything, you are an editor, but not for good reasons.
I would genuinely love, just once, to be called into one of these consulting sessions, and instead of being asked like, hey, can you tell us how this is going to hurt people like you, just be asked, hey, what would you like to see people like you do in this game? What experiences?
And you might need a different career then. Because, again, it's not, they don't have the same priorities for making it about race and gender that you do. You have internalized the idea that making a story about race and gender is just a good idea, but it's not. What actual real writers, something that you could not become, care about is just avoiding pissing people off unnecessarily, but writing the genuinely interesting thing that they want to write. They don't really care about race and gender, and if they do, they don't need to hire you. That's your market niche.
Can people like you bring to the world of the game that we haven't seen before? What's a cool thing that you want to see from characters who look and act like you? And it's not the way we're taught to talk about it, but I think it could be. Because even when we're doing narrative design, we're looking at archetypes every time we want to have a set of answers, right? We're looking, this is what a rebel would do. This is what a jerk would do. This is what a more straight-laced person would do. And I think I would love to start thinking about more like, what option can we make for people who haven't been seen? What can we add that provides a new perspective that we've never explored before? Because I think if
I haven't been seen. Honestly, I haven't been in any major video games. Can we fix that? Oh, but you're a small group. Yeah, but so are these. Suddenly the size of the group doesn't really matter. Okay, so what's to stop me imposing myself? Oh, just sheer competition. See if you can convince someone to do it. Okay, so it's just might makes right. So you have no moral position. No principled standing. That's probably where it would go. Or they would just shut me down and say I'm racist at that point. Or get angry because I used the word tranny. That's the minefield with talking to these people. They don't actually follow strongly principles. They have basic beliefs that fill the slot of principles, but they are ideological. They're not actually principled. They are just ideological precepts that everything flows from. But they're fundamentally wrong. And if you try to apply the principles they think they're following to them, they fall apart. But our opponent is smart. They put minefields in front of their pawns. And the minefields is if you use just the wrong word or just the wrong version of a wording, You talk about it just the wrong way, they can just call you a rude word, and everyone supports that rude word. Well, that's gradually changing.
If we prioritize joy and start to frame representation as, a new.
How about you prioritize gameplay or game story? Rather than the joy of a brown person, how about in the game you prioritize like a quality story? See, this is the problem, is it is possible, I think, to find two theoretically competing ideas and to hybridize them, to find a way to get the good parts of both and the bad parts of neither, to a large extent, in that direction, to hybridize them, to make something better than each one individually. But it's also possible, when doing that, to find a bad compromise where you find something worse than each one individually. Now, trying to find that hybrid is very difficult, and I don't think many people can do it for many things. Certainly, I wouldn't trust you to do so. So usually, when someone tries to mix two things together, it just hurts both things. It just takes time away, takes focus away from the two things. Even the hybridization, there's limits to that, because the more things you try to add, the less you can focus on each individual thing. So you got to be careful with that. If you want to make a story that is about, let's say just an interesting video game story, and someone comes along and says, but can we make it about making brown people feel good? By which you have to do all these things. And then suddenly that has to be inserted in to the extent that you would be happy with. And even if the writers there, the real writers, not you, are very competent and manage to hybridize it, because it has happened, there have been good games which have some ideology in them, but very few. Even if they manage to do that, it's still riddled with stuff that most people don't care about, that's just wasting their time. And it is going to, ultimately, it's going to either extend the length of the thing so it pads it out unnecessarily, or it's going to distract from the point of the game, the good story, regardless of race and gender. So no matter how you insert it, no matter how well you do it, it's always going to be a little bit worse for at least someone shoving this shit in there. But that is because those people care about race and gender. Now, am I saying the audience is wrong? Not necessarily. What I'm saying is they're not really the audience. Because if you're making your game to appeal to people that like good games, then people who want media that makes them feel good about their race aren't your audience. Or at least, if they are your audience, they accept that they're just buying a good game. Or they should do anyway. So, again, it's about the market. If you want to make a game for those people, then you'll make a game for those people. If you want to make a game for gamers, then you'll make a game that's not necessarily for those people, or is, appeals in some ways to those people, but not strongly enough to ruin the game. But she is coming in here, and instead of doing her job, which is just to make this market product safe for the easily offended, instead she's saying this market product should not appeal to gamers. She doesn't realize she's doing that, but that's what she's doing. It should instead appeal to me and people like me who care about race and gender and care about seeing ourselves in the game, which hurts its market performance. Again, from simple beginnings, a few wrong basic assumptions, and quote-unquote good intentions, and probably a little bit of just a few tiny little mental illnesses in there as well, like maybe a little bit borderline, maybe a little bit of autism, you get terrible results. There you go. The rest of the stream I will now be covered by this plank because it has been funded by the audience. There you go. Now that's appealing to the market. That's what the market truly wants. The thing I wanted to talk about during this, which I guess we can get to now, is the idea of representation. Because as I said, there is a section of the audience in the world who wants to see themselves in games. Now, for the rest of this video up until now, I have been harsh to what she's saying, because what she's saying is bullshit. Not lying, it's just you can see exactly the trail from basic wrong assumptions to mass-scale manipulation and ruining of products. That's been the case for the time I've been criticizing her so far. But now I'm going to say something which I think has not been discussed as much as it needs to be on this side of politics. And I wonder what you guys will think about it. It may be that that it's easy to debunk, but I think there might be something to this. Now, I've mentioned before that in the Western world, and particularly whites, but those who are culturally of the West, don't really care about race or gender. And that's been a precept for most of this video. And that's true. They have to be made to care about it by ideology, spread usually, originally, by non-whites and non-Western people. Imposed usually upon them. They just don't really care. It's just not really in the interest of whites and Western people to care, because our culture is so good that an optimal individual of any other race can join it. Not to say that any other race can, because that implies all of them can, but in principle, every other race is compatible because any one person in that race could join our culture. And in fact, much more than one can. In fact, our culture is so good that the entire world has adopted it, for the most part. So it seems like it's not ours anymore, but it is. Western European and their derived cultures, the Anglosphere and the other wealthy nations of the world, the other historically wealthy nations of the world, founded the culture that is now globally applied. The only other culture that got anywhere near that was Japan, was like medieval, maybe late medieval. Whilst we were industrial revolution and then atomic, and our civilization became dominant, and everything beyond medieval has been because of Western inventions. Now, that's a little bit of a tangent, but the point is, we don't care about race and gender in the West by default. It has to be forced upon us. The only exception is back 50, 100 years ago, it was not necessarily about blacks. That was just the correlate, but it was Democrats specifically who cared about it. So there are those who care about it for those reasons, but generally speaking, we just don't care about those things. However, other races do. There have been studies on this that whites have have a much less in-group preference, and in some cases actually have an out-group preference these days, but every other race has a clear in-group preference. It's quite in contrary to what those, to what ideologues would claim about whites, that whites are racist. No, whites are the least racist people probably ever in history. That's not a joke. Whites and the Western world abolished slavery. We're the only ones that did it. We actually went abroad to other places to do war with people in order to abolish slavery, in part. Of course, the US Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. And the slavers were a tiny minority of the people there. The victors wrote the history books and said it was about slavery, but it wasn't. Whites have, by far, the best record on slavery in the world, if you want to compare it by race. Because whilst whites did briefly do slavery, they then abolished it in other places around the world, destroyed slave cultures, never used it before that time. It was really introduced all of a sudden. Some claim it was not even introduced originally to white civilization by whites. And every other race in the world has done slavery in one form or another for longer than whites. In many cases, it was worse than the way whites did it. Because the way whites do it was usually more moral than has been done. And in many cases, still do it. All modern slavery is committed by states or groups which are not led by whites. Except, of course, the evil, corrupt elements of our system's psychopaths, which the rest of us are trying to get rid of, which are an abhorrence to the culture of the societies they represent. So, other races, however, do care. Maybe it's a very early civilizational adaptation, and a biological adaptation. Maybe you go far enough back, whites did too, but stopped because it just isn't as relevant as culture. But other races haven't quite reached that point yet, so they do care more about race. They do have a more in-group preference. So when you look at media and you see white people in it, you don't need to care. Even if the movie is all black with one white person, you don't generally care, except to the degree that modern politics has made that interesting. But would you emotionally care? Would you care? Would you feel joy from that? Would that matter to you beyond the emotional, the ideology? Would you have cared 20 years ago? Almost none of us would have done. especially not in Cabal, but even outside of Cabal, almost none of us would have done. It just doesn't really matter. Now, you could argue that because whites are in almost everything, then it becomes irrelevant, but there are plenty of media which does not have whites in it entirely, and I've never really seen that be a concern. Besides which, of course, it makes sense that they would be in everything because it's the majority of the population and creators. So it doesn't really matter, race and gender-wise. But beyond race and gender, if you are of a certain identity, I think probably even some of us care just a little bit about representation, which sounds weird because this is a leftist talking point. But I expect some of us care, yes, a little bit. Because if I am watching something which is full of Americans, and if I see one British person who is well presented, who is presented not as a joke, but as a good character, if that's slightly gratifying, I barely care, but I care just a little tiny bit. It's just a little tiny positive. I expect most of us have something similar that we have a preference for. If you see someone in media, maybe even that just thinks like you, so it's not as crass as race or gender, as I mentioned before, but someone who just thinks a little like you, someone who you can identify with beyond the actual overarching story, but just about the character themselves. That, I think, is representation, and from that, we might be able to understand a little bit how these people, particularly her here, who clearly she got the in-group racial preference genetically, or is at least acting like she does, why she would care about it. And the market catering to that is fine. So this idea of representation in media, this idea of wanting to care about it, is not inherently wrong. In fact, I think it's a normal market force. The problem is making it about race and gender, which is abhorrent to Western culture. It just isn't something that we generally care about, and I think for good reasons. Maybe it's true that we don't care enough about it, but either way, it's just not something we care about. So making it about race and gender isn't good, but in general, seeing yourself in media, I think, is something that most people do care about at least a little bit. I think that's worth considering, because if you accept that, then it's a little harder to figure out what's wrong with what she's saying here, which is why I've tried to be precise and not just completely denounce the entire raft of ideas out of hand. Because I believe that she honestly does value seeing people like her in media. And in her case, it is about race, but some people do have that preference. Now, as I said, because of that, it is a market force. And if the market wants to attenuate to that and wants to make media that appeals to that, that's okay. And if they make media that ends up being bad because of that, that's their loss. But of course, there's so many distortions on that market that it's not, in fact, acting freely, and the market force is being dramatically over-exaggerated. And even beyond that, the market force's demand is being over-exaggerated by the importation of people whose culture, frankly, doesn't really fit with the West. People who do care too much about race. And of course, with all the immigration, it's very prevalent in the UK as well, as it is in some ways in the US, though not as much in this regard. Although actually, I guess, because, you know, blacks and Muslims, similar problem. They care very much about seeing their identity in media. With Muslims, in that case, it's not even racial, though that is also there, the Arabs, but it's about the religion. But chat, if you were watching media where every character was an atheist, and say you're Christian, and you see a Christian and they're not the butt of any jokes, they're just a good character, I expect you would be quite gratified by that. So that's what I wanted to address to you, that some of our enemies' ideas are not just entirely wrong. There is a reasonable basis for them, and understanding the importance of that is to understand how their propaganda works. They don't just make shit up and then force people to believe it. They latch onto existing things and make them evil. And it's the same thing here. Same thing where they latch onto media to make them evil. They also latch onto the desire to see people like yourself, to see characters you would identify with in some way in media, and turn that into an evil by imposing things like race and gender and by making it so much more of a demand than it really is. I think that's something that Assad hasn't really considered very well. The field says the point of fiction is to relate to people who are unlike yourself. I disagree to a large extent. There are people that you can get value from that, absolutely. And I'm not saying that that's like that is a valuable thing, but it's not the only valuable. It's not the point. The point of fiction, arguably, is to relate to people who are exactly like you in situations that you will never encounter yourself. But the situation can have relevance because of principles, because of basic things about it. These are why stories are lessons. You would enjoy stories when they have relevance to reality, but are also different enough from reality to extend the realms of human imagination. Because we're always trying to extend the limits of what we do or imagine or whatever else, reaching out into the darkness. So these new ideas can form even newer ideas, and they can lead to new ways to express these lessons of life. But ultimately, it's about deeply buried within these stories. It's about the lessons. Achilles says, I feel like this whole spiel about seeing yourself in media is a byproduct of a couple of generations of narcissists who are trained to seek media that only validates themselves instead of challenging them or inspiring them. When I read about how ancients related to their fiction, they wanted to emulate the heroes instead of whining about their heroes, not emulating them. Yeah, so what I'm saying, Achilles, at no point did I say that that is the point. Or like, if you're just talking about her specifically, she has taken it too far for sure. Maybe what you're saying is true. But my point that at base, the representation thing is not inherently invalid and that we all want it to some minor extent. I'm not saying that's the only reason. It is minor. My point is only that it's not a zero thing. It's not that the only people who care are those who've been indoctrinated into caring. All of us care just a little tiny bit. I think Cabal is not a good crowd to approach this with, because Cabal is mostly autistic or ADHD, and I think those are the clusters of personality traits which are the most distant from caring about that kind of thing. But even then, I think probably some of us in here do care just a little bit about it. I know that I've seen 8-Bit posting Chancla memes. Most of 8-Bit's memes feature women as the speaking character. 8-Bit played Lara Croft. I do wonder if any of this is because of the women, because of the Spanish people in it, because of seeing yourself in something is in some way gratifying. I think it is because the lesson is therefore theoretically more applicable to you if the character being used as the sort of player in the story is more similar to you. So it makes perfect sense that people would seek something more similar to them. Chat, Achilles, you read about ancients related to how the ancients related to their fiction. It's very possible that you were reading exclusively about ancients that were similar to you. that you didn't read about the court gossip from the ancient Greece or Rome. Hey, maybe you did, but you didn't. That wasn't the focus. You read about ancient warriors and ancient diplomats and ancient magnates of industry and inventors, I expect. They cared less about seeing themselves in media and more about achieving things and making the world a better place. But you cared about that kind of character because it's like you. I think there's a little bit of this in all of us.